Taylor Swift became a global phenomenon. But at the height of her success, she owned nothing that truly mattered. Her songs. Her voice. Sold without her consent. While the world celebrated her empire, she was quietly erased from her own work. This isn't a story about fame. It's a story about who really controls power, and who pays the price. At the height of her career, Taylor Swift learned a brutal truth. The songs she wrote. The melodies she lived through. The stories that defined her identity. They were no longer hers. Behind closed doors, her master recordings were sold. Not negotiated with her. Not offered to her. Simply transferred, as assets. For most artists, this would be devastating. For a songwriter whose work is deeply autobiographical, it was something worse. It meant her voice could be licensed, reshaped, and profited from, without her consent. It meant the most personal chapters of her life were now controlled by people who had no part in writing them. The industry called it business. But to Taylor, it felt like erasure. She wasn't fighting for money. She was fighting for authorship. For the right to decide how her own story would be told, and who was allowed to tell it. What made the moment colder was the silence. There were no public arguments. No dramatic exits. Just the quiet realization that success did not equal power. In an industry built on contracts, youth, and control, Taylor Swift discovered the cost of trusting a system that was never designed to protect creators. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. This was not the collapse. It was the fracture, the one that forces a decision. What she lost wasn't just ownership. It was the ability to decide when her own voice would be used, and when it would be silenced. Long before contracts and negotiations, Taylor Swift learned a quieter lesson. Approval was never automatic. It had to be earned. She was born into a stable, supportive family, not poverty, not chaos. But stability does not erase pressure. From an early age, she learned that being noticed meant being exceptional. And being exceptional meant never giving people a reason to look away. As a child, Taylor watched how attention worked. Who received it? Who lost it? And how quickly admiration could turn into dismissal. Music became her language before it became her career. Not as rebellion, but as control. Writing gave her something rare, the ability to decide how a story began, where it turned, and how it ended. While other children spoke freely, she refined. While others experimented, she edited. Each lyric was a way of making herself understandable and acceptable. Her parents believed in her talent. They invested time, resources, relocation. Not recklessly, but deliberately. Because even then, it was clear this was not a phase. It was an identity forming under observation. But belief came with expectations. And expectations come with conditions. Taylor learned to read rooms early. To sense what people wanted before they said it. To soften edges. To adjust tone. To stay likable. This instinct would later be called professionalism. But at its core, it was survival. In school, she was visible, and therefore vulnerable. Success made her noticeable. Difference made her a target. Being ambitious, articulate, and emotionally open carried a cost. She learned that confidence invited judgment. That emotion invited mockery. That being earnest was dangerous. So she adapted. She smiled when misunderstood. She stayed quiet when dismissed. She turned discomfort into composition. Music wasn't just expression. It was documentation. A way to preserve moments before they could be rewritten by someone else. By her teenage years, Taylor was already negotiating identity. Not with lawyers. But with peers, expectations, and invisible standards she never agreed to, yet had to meet. The industry would later tell her who she was allowed to be. But long before that, she had already learned the rules: be grateful. Be agreeable. Be successful, but never threatening. These lessons didn't break her. They trained her. They taught her patience, precision, and restraint. Most importantly, they taught her something that would echo decades later: if you don't protect your voice, someone else will decide how it's used. She didn't know yet how costly that truth would become. Only that control mattered, even when it was invisible. And that one day, losing it would hurt more than losing anything else. Taylor Swift entered the music industry early. Not with illusions, but with preparation. She didn't stumble into opportunity. She pursued it methodically. Songwriting sessions. Demo recordings. Meetings where adults spoke in numbers while she spoke in melodies. When her first contract came, it looked like validation. A doorway opening. A future taking shape. But early success often arrives with fine print. At that age, leverage is an illusion. Experience is limited. Authority belongs elsewhere. Decisions are made in rooms you're not invited into, yet. Taylor learned quickly that visibility did not equal control. She could write. She could perform. She could deliver results. But ownership was never part of the conversation. Her role was clear: create, adapt, be reliable. The system rewarded productivity, not authorship. Youth, not longevity. Momentum, not autonomy. And so she complied. She wrote relentlessly. She toured tirelessly. She learned to meet expectations before questioning them. The industry praised her discipline, her professionalism, her gratitude. Few noticed the imbalance. Fewer questioned it. Behind the scenes, contracts defined limits she didn't fully understand, because she wasn't expected to challenge them. She was expected to succeed within them. At first, this felt reasonable. Even necessary. Trust the process. Trust the people who know better. The cost of that trust would not be immediate. It would arrive later. Quietly. Legally. As her profile grew, so did the machinery around her. Teams expanded. Schedules tightened. Expectations multiplied. But authority did not follow success. It remained centralized, elsewhere. She was becoming powerful in the public eye, yet increasingly dependent behind closed doors. This contradiction went unnoticed because the results were undeniable. Hits, awards, momentum. The industry doesn't warn artists when they're trading control for acceleration. It doesn't need to. By the time questions emerge, the structure is already locked in place. Taylor Swift was building a career faster than most artists ever would. But she was doing it inside a framework she did not design, and could not yet rewrite. At that stage, resistance would have meant delay, silence, risk. So she chose forward motion. Not because she didn't see the limits, but because stopping would have cost her everything she had worked to create. This was not naivety. It was calculation. She believed there would be time later. Time to renegotiate. Time to reclaim. The industry thrives on that assumption. And for a while, it worked. Until the moment arrived when momentum no longer protected her, and success finally revealed its price. Taylor Swift's rise was swift, public, and undeniable. Albums topped charts. Tours expanded arenas. Awards followed momentum. From the outside, it looked like control. Inside, it was choreography. Her image was carefully framed. Approachable. Relatable. Safe. The industry celebrated her as a phenomenon, while quietly defining the boundaries of that phenomenon for her. She was praised for writing her own songs. Then questioned for it. Admired for vulnerability. Then mocked for it. Success amplified everything except authority. As her audience grew, so did the expectations placed on her behavior. Speak, but not too loudly. Feel, but not too much. Evolve, but not beyond what can be managed. The narrative was consistent, talented, but guided. Powerful, but protected. Successful, but replaceable. Taylor learned to exist inside contradiction. She delivered outcomes the industry relied on, while being treated as a temporary asset within it. Public recognition came faster than internal respect. Meetings increased. Schedules tightened. Decisions accelerated. But ownership did not move with scale. It remained fixed, contractual, procedural, unquestioned. The more successful she became, the less room there was to slow down and reassess. Momentum doesn't pause for reflection. It demands continuation. In interviews, she smiled. On stage, she performed certainty. Behind closed doors, control stayed abstract. The media framed her as prolific. The business framed her as compliant. Both benefited. Her catalog expanded. So did the value attached to it, by people who did not write it. This was the paradox of her ascent. Every achievement increased her visibility, while reinforcing a structure that excluded her from ultimate decisions. Power appeared cumulative. In reality, it was conditional. Taylor was allowed to grow, within limits. She could push sound. She could refine identity. But the foundation remained unchanged. Contracts outlasted eras. Ownership outlasted success. The industry prefers stability over authorship. Predictability over autonomy. As long as results continued, questions stayed deferred. And Taylor continued delivering. Not out of blindness, but out of awareness. She understood that challenging the system at its peak would mean confrontation without leverage. Public support does not translate to legal authority. So she waited. This patience was misinterpreted as acceptance. It wasn't. It was timing. Because while the world watched her rise as a pop icon, something else was happening quietly beneath the surface. She was learning how power actually works. Who holds it? How it moves. And how long it can be borrowed before it's taken back. The stage lights grew brighter. The applause grew louder. But the distance between fame and control remained unchanged. And that distance would soon become impossible to ignore. What Taylor didn't realize yet was this: the higher her career climbed, the more valuable her voice became, to everyone except herself. The moment did not arrive with drama. There were no confrontations. No warnings. It arrived as information. Taylor Swift learned that her master recordings, the original versions of the songs she wrote, recorded, and built her career on, had been sold. Not transferred. Not renegotiated. Sold. The transaction was legal. Efficient. Final. In the language of the industry, it was routine. In the reality of authorship, it was erasure. She was not offered control. She was not given a path to ownership. She was informed, after the fact. For an artist whose work was inseparable from her identity, this wasn't just a business outcome. It was a loss of agency. The industry often frames ownership as a technical detail. A clause. A precedent. But for creators, ownership determines who speaks, and who profits when they do. Taylor understood that distinction immediately. Her songs were now assets. Assets could be licensed, repackaged, monetized. They could be used in contexts she didn't choose. For narratives she didn't approve. By people who had never written a word. The system did not ask for her consent because it did not require it. That was the first realization. The second was quieter. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was structural. In moments like these, the industry rarely responds with dialogue. It responds with patience, waiting for outrage to fade. Taylor did not explode publicly. She did not launch a campaign. She did not attempt to negotiate through emotion. She understood how power would interpret that. Instead, she absorbed the reality. Contracts do not care about contribution. They care about control. Years of discipline had taught her this language. Years of success had taught her its consequences. What made the moment colder was not the loss itself, but how predictable it was in hindsight. The industry had rewarded her productivity. It had benefited from her image. It had profited from her catalog. But it had never designed a structure where her authority matched her output. This wasn't personal. It was systemic. Creators are encouraged to believe that success leads to autonomy. That visibility earns respect. That longevity results in leverage. The system functions on the opposite assumption. Youth is flexible. Momentum is exploitable. Compliance is profitable. Taylor Swift had fulfilled every expectation placed on her. She had delivered consistency, scale, and cultural relevance. And still, the moment control mattered most, she had none. Public perception lagged behind reality. Fans debated. Media simplified. Headlines reduced complexity to conflict. But the core issue remained unchanged. This was not about revenge, or ego, or money. It was about authorship. About the right to decide how your own work lives in the world. Taylor did not lose her voice in a dramatic collapse. She lost it through procedure. That distinction matters. Because procedural loss is harder to fight. There is no villain to confront, only agreements to interpret. And agreements are protected by silence. For a period, Taylor said very little. Not because she lacked words. But because words would not restore control. The industry mistook this restraint for acceptance. It wasn't. It was analysis. She studied how power responded to compliance. How it dismissed protest. How it relied on time to neutralize resistance. She recognized a familiar pattern. The system expected her to move on. To release new work. To let the past remain owned by others. Most artists do. Not because they agree, but because they cannot afford to fight. Taylor could afford to wait. That difference changed everything. Still, the psychological cost was real. Knowing that your most personal work can be repurposed without you creates a specific kind of fracture. Not loud. Not visible. But constant. It alters how you create, how you trust, how you define safety. Taylor had built a career on transparency, on inviting listeners into emotional truth. Now, that truth could be extracted and used independently of her presence. She had become optional to her own catalog. That is the moment the industry rarely acknowledges. When creators realize they are no longer necessary to what they created. This is where many retreat, where bitterness replaces clarity, where silence becomes withdrawal. Taylor chose something else. She did not rush to reclaim the past. She did not ask permission to correct it. She began preparing for a future the system had not anticipated. Quietly, legally, deliberately. The betrayal did not harden her. It sharpened her. She understood now that power would never be granted. It would only be taken back, through structure, not confrontation. This was not the collapse the public expected. There were no visible ruins. Only a decision forming beneath the surface. A decision that would later redefine ownership, not just for her, but for anyone paying attention. Taylor Swift did not respond with outrage. She responded with strategy. There was no public countdown. No immediate declaration. No attempt to reverse what had already been finalized. She understood something the system relied on: most resistance is emotional. And emotional resistance is predictable. Instead, she asked a different question. Not who took control, but how control could be rebuilt. The answer wasn't symbolic. It was technical. Contracts define ownership. But they also define possibility. Taylor realized she could not retrieve the past as it existed. But she could change what the past meant. Re-recording was not nostalgia. It was reconstruction. By recreating her albums, she wasn't chasing memory. She was altering the legal reality around it. New recordings meant new masters. New masters meant new authority. This wasn't rebellion. It was compliance, redirected. The decision required patience, precision, endurance. There would be no shortcuts. No emotional release. Only process. She revisited work written years earlier, not to relive it, but to reclaim its function. Each track became a statement of intent. Not louder. Clearer. The industry initially underestimated the move. It assumed fatigue, disinterest, limited impact. It misunderstood scale. Taylor did not ask listeners to take sides. She gave them an option. And when given a choice between authenticity and convenience, audiences noticed. What followed wasn't confrontation. It was migration. Streams shifted. Licensing preferences changed. Cultural weight moved quietly, but decisively. The system had not anticipated collective participation in structural change. This was not about revenge. It was about alignment. Taylor aligned legal structure with creative truth. She aligned audience loyalty with authorship. In doing so, she exposed a flaw the industry prefers to keep hidden: ownership is only powerful if people accept it. By rebuilding her catalog on her terms, she removed dependence from the equation. She didn't need permission. She didn't need apology. She needed time. And time, applied correctly, became leverage. This was the turning point. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was irreversible. Once power is reconstructed, it doesn't announce itself. It simply stops being questioned. Taylor Swift's decision did not disrupt the industry overnight. It did something quieter, and more permanent. It changed expectations. By re-recording her catalog, she demonstrated that ownership was not theoretical. It was actionable. For the first time in a mainstream context, audiences were asked to consider which version of a song they were supporting, and why. This shift was subtle but consequential. Young artists began asking different questions. Not just about fame or reach, but about control, duration, and rights. Labels took notice. Not publicly. Internally. Because precedent is dangerous. It forces adaptation without permission. Taylor's actions did not dismantle the system. They revealed its dependencies. The industry depends on predictability. On artists moving forward instead of looking back. On contracts being final rather than revisited. By doing the opposite, carefully and legally, she exposed how fragile those assumptions were. This wasn't activism. It was architecture. She didn't challenge power with ideology. She challenged it with structure. In doing so, she expanded the definition of success. Success was no longer just scale or longevity. It included authorship. This recalibration mattered. Because many creators do not lose control through conflict. They lose it through acceleration. Taylor's case offered an alternative model: slow down, read, decide. The impact extended beyond music. Writers, filmmakers, and digital creators began referencing ownership earlier in their careers. Not as an afterthought, but as a foundation. Taylor did not present herself as a spokesperson. She did not claim victory. She continued working. That restraint reinforced the shift. Power that needs to be announced often isn't stable. Power that is built quietly tends to last. The legacy wasn't in the numbers, though the numbers followed. It was in the normalization of choice. Choice over silence. Structure over assumption. Agency over convenience. Taylor Swift did not change the industry by fighting it. She changed it by making an alternative unavoidable. That is how systems evolve. Not when they are attacked, but when they are outgrown. Taylor Swift's story was never about losing control. It was about recognizing when control had already been taken, quietly, legally, and permanently. She did not become powerful by confronting the system. She became powerful by understanding it. Her response wasn't louder music. It wasn't public outrage. It wasn't a demand for sympathy. It was a redesign. She accepted that the past could not be retrieved in its original form. So she changed what the past represented. That distinction matters. Because most people don't lose their voice all at once. They lose it gradually, through contracts they don't read, roles they don't question, expectations they don't choose. Taylor's decision wasn't about reclaiming songs. It was about reclaiming authorship. And authorship is not exclusive to artists. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt replaceable inside their own work. Anyone who has watched their effort benefit a structure that never planned to protect them. Her story offers no easy formula. Only a reminder. Power rarely arrives with permission. It appears when clarity meets patience, and structure replaces hope. Taylor Swift didn't ask to be heard again. She made sure she couldn't be ignored. So before the world decides how your story is told, ask yourself one question. So what's your story?